everybody. My name is Kath Knapp, and I'm happy to welcome Susan Schwartz as our speaker today. She's going to present Military Generals, Mindfulness, and Emotional Intelligence. She's led a variety of corporate and government teams through organizational change and technology transformation. Her change toolbox combines emotional intelligence, Lego serious play, and knowledge sharing methods. I got a chance to meet Susan 2 or 3 years ago at a conference, and she had just published her book and spoken about it, and I was just kind of wowed with some of the points that she brought forward. So I'm very happy that she's speaking for us today. Susan?
Thank you. Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here at the Mid-South PDD Day. I was just sharing with the room monitors that I've been a project manager my whole career, and I didn't even know I was a project manager. And then about 12 years ago, I became aware of Project Management Institute and realized that it was a career opportunity, and I became a PMP. I walked a half marathon 4.5 years ago, and I took me about 4 hours and 15 minutes, and I will walk a half marathon again. I never want to take that PMP exam again. So I keep my PDUs up, and I'm so happy that all of you are here keeping yours up as well, because none of us want to take that exam. Once I became a PMP, I've done a lot of work throughout my career in technology education, and I started teaching at the local university in Northern Virginia in their PMP certificate curriculum. And along the way, someone convinced me that emotional intelligence had many benefits and could really add a different perspective for project managers. So I got certified, and they were absolutely right. I developed an elective, and not to brag, but it was the most popular elective in that curriculum. And based on that, I started adapting it and putting it into different formats. And along the way, all of a sudden, our student demographics shifted. We'd always had a lot of people who were government subcontractors working in the private sector. And quite suddenly, we had many military people coming through. And I wanted to adapt some of our exercises so that they could relate better to them since they were in the military. Now, I've never been in the military. I can honestly say my best friend was in the military. My across the way neighbor was a 2-star general. And my son's best friend is recently retired from the Navy. But I never was in the service. So I thought, how else do you figure it out? I bought a book. And the book I found was called The Generals by Thomas Ricks. And Thomas Ricks is a journalist. And that's one of the reasons I bought the book, because I thought I'd get the real scoop out of him. And it did have a great amount of technical information. But what I pulled out of it was just how intuitive these generals were. The book looked at the generals from the latter half of the 20th century, so World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and the Gulf Wars. And as I was going through the book, I just, when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. As I was going through the book, I was making all these notes. I found all these connections with emotional intelligence. I went, oh my gosh, these generals were so fabulous. It was their mindfulness, their thoughtfulness, their attention they paid to their soldiers. They really were servant leaders. And that's probably why so many business metaphors relate back to the military. And so what I'd like to share in this presentation is looking at the framework that these generals set, how I recognize the mindfulness, the emotional intelligence, and how I've adapted it and created a bond between these military generals, mindfulness, emotional intelligence, and project managers. And one quick note, when I was writing my book that Kath kindly mentioned, it's called Creating a Greater Whole, a Project Manager's Guide to Becoming a Leader. I had to go back and get citations for each of the quotes I had. And when I went back, I could not find a single reference to emotional intelligence. And that's when I really believe that adage, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every solution for me was emotional intelligence. And I appreciate the opportunity for you all to let me share. Oh, Amber, thank you. It's always good to find a fellow traveler. And while we're looking at chat, I understand that one of your speakers this morning talked about mindfulness. And I was curious if anybody felt the inspiration, if you could just type into chat something that you took out of that session, if it was a new perspective on mindfulness, if it reinforced one of your beliefs. Would anybody, please share that in chat, and that would help me adapt this, my remarks to some of your recent experience. Ooh, oh my gosh, taking a moment to breathe. Breathing is excellent, especially when you're in a tight spot, because it gets oxygen to your brain and gives everybody a moment to calm down, and you can think better. All right. Well, those are some great comments. Now, a lot of times when people think about mindfulness, they imagine these people doing yoga and they're sitting cross-legged and they're breathing, which is excellent. I truly believe that that is a good practice. When I think about mindfulness and project managers, I get very, very practical. I started life out in the telecommunications field. I designed integrated voice and data systems. At one time, I could detail that 7-layer OSI model and cut down a 10-base T cable. I don't think those technologies are even used today. But I like to be very practical when I start to apply some of these concepts. Leadership traits are so intangible. I find that many people kind of shut down. And so what I believe in emotional intelligence and what I'm hoping to do today is to share some practical applications that you can go back tomorrow or the day after and start using some of these concepts with your team. And one of the most excellent examples I've seen, Dr. Ellen Langer is a Harvard University professor. Her field is sociology. And somewhere at some cocktail party, she wondered, why are some Harvard MBA graduates so successful and others not so successful? And she got fun. She goes, oh, I'm a researcher. She got some money. She started studying the MBAs who come in with, they have to get a certain grade point. They have to make a certain score on the GMATs. They all take the same courses. What is the difference? And what she discovered was mindfulness versus mindlessness. So at the very core, I believe mindfulness is the key of paying attention. We're going to come back to that paying attention concept later. And mindlessness is, I wouldn't necessarily say not paying attention, but not paying attention in the moment. And what Dr. Langer defines this as is mindlessness is the application of yesterday's business solutions to today's problems. So putting that into a project management perspective, when we close out a project, we have lessons learned, we document them, we tie them up with a beautiful bow, and we put that on the shelf or in a file in our knowledge repository. 18 to 24 months later, we get a really similar project. We're good doobies. We say, let's go pull out those lessons learned. Mindless managers take out those lessons, and what you see here in the arrows, they're very, very linear. So they apply the lessons in exactly the same way they were applied 18 months ago. So what is the one thing we can count on in our world today? Anybody? Any thoughts? Thank you, Sherry. It's
Amber just
change.
mentioned.
Thank you, Dawn, and everybody that's put change. That is the only thing we could count on. So what Dr. Langer discovered when she looked at what made those successful MBAs successful, was that they were mindful, they paid attention. And her definition is mindfulness is the attunement of today's demands to avoid tomorrow's difficulties. So what they did is they pulled out those lessons learned and they said, wow, how is the world different today? And they would adapt them so things could be successful because they were adapting them in today's world. They didn't say just because we've always done it that way means we have to do it the same way. They said, what did we do right? What do we adapt? And the very most successful Harvard MBAs went to that third step, how do we move forward? So not only did they adapt for today's situation, they would create a template or some sort of checklist to help project managers who moving forward take those lessons learned, how they adapted them, and give them a means to, in the future, adjust to make their jobs and their lives just a little bit easier. And so that's why I chose the balloon. It's that whole huge perspective, being able to fly high and not only see what's directly below you, but far into the distance. And so when I think about mindfulness, I think about paying attention, and I think of mindlessness as linear thinking. Any thoughts or questions? Oh, it's good talking to the choir about change. Nothing stays the same. So
We have no questions.
thank you. And so this leads us into looking at leadership and emotional intelligence. Now, this is a quote by Daniel Goleman, and Richard Boyatzis and Annie McKee are his co-authors of this book, Primal Leadership. And if you're looking for an easy to read discussion on what emotional intelligence really is in a relatively practical environment, I highly recommend this book, Primal Leadership. And it's reasonably priced. It's either just under or just over $20. And I know from my, my career, just because somebody has a title, it doesn't necessarily make them a leader. I won't even, you can just nod your heads if you want to put into chat. I'm sure all of us have had those people who had the title of leader, but they didn't instill the confidence in us. And a title and 50 cents will not buy you a cup of coffee. Yep, I see several people have had that experience. And what I realized, I was working for AT&T during divestiture. There was huge change. People were worried about their jobs, where would they work, which was the better company to choose. And our direct manager just towed the company line, which was his job. And we had somebody on our team who was nearing retirement, Floyd. And so whenever things got really dicey and things were sort of emotional, we would look at Floyd and he would just smile or nod, and we relaxed. And so Floyd was our informal leader. And that's how you tell, that's what a real leader does. That is the person that bad things just happen. When a disaster is pending, people go to those leaders that they can trust and look for the assurance and clarity when they're feeling the uncertainty of change or the threat of a huge risk. And that's what real leaders do. And when we talk about confidence, it's not just that the leader is confident. I'm going to share a big secret. We're just making it up as we go along. They may look like they're confident, but what they're really good at, besides faking it, is instilling the confidence through delegation and allowing other people to learn and grow and adapt their management styles so they can become a leader also. Succession planning is an amazing trait when a leader exhibits that generosity of sharing their knowledge. I like to say leadership is not a solo sport. You can't do everything by yourself. And that's what real leaders do, is they acknowledge the power of their teams and look at their individual strengths. And frankly, this is my favorite part about emotional intelligence. I really wish we could give it a different name. Because emotional intelligence, when it's applied to leadership and your teams, is all about balance. I like to say that it's about behaviors and choices. So you recognize the world around you, and you might have a hot button. So being aware of what's going to set you off lets you practice how you might respond. And that's where all of these metal balls are looking at. They are the choices that this large, this is you, the big silver ball, and you get to choose how you balance behaviors. You get to make that choice. I mean, quick aside, it's a good ending. My son is 27. He's paying his own rent. He has a lovely girlfriend. On his 10th birthday, he was diagnosed with cancer, and he had a relapse. And on the couple days before his bar mitzvah, we met with the rabbi, and my son had to go over his speech. And his coach had helped him with the speech. 13-year-olds and parents, it's like oil and water. It was just better that his coach took care of that. And I had not heard this, but part of his speech was that he had a choice. And the rabbi looked at him and he said, "What do you mean?" And my son said, "I did not choose to get cancer, but now that I have it, I get to choose how I behave." And out of the mouths of babes. So we may not choose the situation we get into. We may be put on a project that is, the person before us, it's a mess. But we get to choose whether we complain or whether we roll up our sleeves and work with our teams to leverage their strengths and move forward. And that's where these are the 5, this tower that you see are the 5 basic levels of emotional intelligence. There's a lot of detail underneath. Well, let me just quickly give you some definitions. So self-perception is the first level. That's how you view the world and the world views you. So as a project manager, that is the goal of your project. That is your vision, your mission. Self-expression is how you communicate that vision to other people. You may communicate differently between the stakeholder, the client, your direct reporting team people, or how many of us have people on our project teams that don't report to us, and we have to negotiate for their time and skills from their reporting manager. So we're going to communicate differently. Interpersonal is, I like to say, how well we play with others. And what that means to a project manager is how do we bring everybody together to execute that project? Stress management, bad things just happen. They do. So how do you react to stress? And how do the people on your team react to stress? Even more importantly, how does your client react to stress so you can balance it out? I had one gentleman, one of my workshops, he was a government contractor who specialized in IT. So you can just imagine the explosions. There was a crisis every day. And he handled stress by waving his arms and jumping and screaming and just really, some people might say overreacting, but he was very physical. His admin didn't react that way. She would go back to her desk. She was very calm. And he wanted to fire her because he didn't think she'd got the urgency of their business. And after the workshop, it was a Wednesday, Thursday workshop, he was going to fire her on Friday. He told me this after the fact. And he thought, well, she has other good skills. He learned that people react differently to stress. So he could fire her this Friday or next Friday. And in that week, he watched her. And what he realized is while he's flailing his arms and getting upset, she was going back to her desk, going through her electronic Rolodex, and finding the people who could solve the problem. So guess what? Instead of firing her, he gave her a raise. So by recognizing people's strengths, you can bring them out and make your team stronger by acknowledging and recognizing them. Or like in a self-expression, some people are fabulous writers and documenters. Other people can't put a sentence together, but they love talking and they're really good on their feet and making presentations. Why don't you team them up? And they can each learn from each other. And then that gets us down to the decision making as we're working with each other and we're trying to collaborate. Decision making is how do you problem solve? How do people like to problem solve? Some people, and I'm one of them, you like to get in a room and have flip charts and sticky notes, and I'm trying to learn Mural to figure out how to use those sticky notes now. And other people like to be thoughtful. I have a dear friend who is one of those thoughtful people, and she wants to go away and come back and then present her ideas. So you have to learn how to balance them and how best to use your team in different situations. And so that's one of the reasons why I really appreciate emotional intelligence and look at it from a leadership perspective. And it impacts so many careers differently, but it's the same basic concepts. What is your mission? How do you communicate that mission? How do you bring people together for that mission? How do you handle stress? And then once you've done and you've realized kind of what the direction you need to go, how do you bring your team together to brainstorm and problem solve? And that's where we come back to the generals, to military leadership. And as I was reading this book and the 4 different wars, I learned 4 lessons from each of those wars. The first was giving second chances. The second one was to be present. That's where mindfulness comes in, paying attention, being present. The third one I learned was adapt with change, right? Being mindful, looking at how things have changed. And the last one was to enlarge that perspective and to be able to look at a situation from different ways and to consider people's opinions and where they're coming from. So let's take a look. Let's go back to World War II. And General George Marshall. Now, I always thought General George Marshall had something to do with the NATO plan. It might say something about the high school education curriculum. Turns out he was Eisenhower's and Patton's boss. So think about trying to manage George Patton. They put a monument up on the mall in Washington to Eisenhower today. And so he was a very humble man. And I believe Patton was just the opposite. But what I learned from General Marshall, and as I was reading about some of the choices and decisions he made, is he believed that people are going to make mistakes. Is that amazing? How often do we get to make a mistake in today's world? Are we afraid of making mistakes? Brene Brown talks about teams that are dysfunctional and functional, and dysfunctional teams pull apart when bad things happen, and they have to point fingers and blames and clear themselves of any responsibility before they solve that problem. Whereas functional teams come together. They don't point fingers, they don't lay blame, they are all accountable. They realize that mistakes happen. One of my favorite quotes from Marshall is, how can I send someone out to do something they've never been trained or done before and not expect them to make a mistake? And so he developed that whole network of military training bases. I'm really aging myself. Gomer Pyle was in the 60s. You might still be seeing reruns. That was a training camp that was Marshall's vision, so that people could be, they would be able to select the right people for the right jobs and get the right people doing the right jobs so they'd be successful. And the other thing he really believed, part of second chances, was that people needed to recharge. You know, in the States, the Europeans really, they get 6 weeks of vacation. We are allotted 2. How many of you take your full vacation time every year? We're so worried that people might find out that we're not, as indispensable as we thought. But out in the battlefield, he really believed in relief and reassignment. There were 6 generals, and they all were fabulous and excellent leaders. But as World War II and as the frontline combat went on, they started making some small mistakes. And he could have fired them. But what he did is he said, you know what? And I'm from the South. I grew up in North Florida. We won't talk football teams. But he realized that they were just tired. Tired is wishy-washy. Tired is when you work really hard at the end of that day. And so what he did is he sent them back to have them oversee the training camps, and they could share their combat experience and be able to prepare other people. And so that's where he gets into relief, reassignment, recharge those batteries, and return to your frontline assignment, which not only is the battlefield. I mean, when I was a project manager, how often did you feel like you were in combat? It was duck and cover. I had 1 chocolate chip cookie stress, 2 chocolate chip cookie stress, and then I stopped eating. Usually I stopped at 2 chocolate chip cookie stress, which may or may not have been a good thing. But when those 6 generals came back from their assignments, recharged, 5 of them were incredibly successful. The 6th one was still tired. And that person, received an honor, he retired honorably. It was just time for him to move on to a different time of life. And that's what I just believe, second chances and, forgiveness for people. It's a gift you give yourself as well as the other person, because it allows you to move forward. You're not harboring all those ill feelings. And yeah, thank you, Angie. It's good to see another comfort food person. Well, and then we get to the Korean War. And General Douglas MacArthur was a strong general in the Pacific during World War II. When he was asked to lead the Korean War, you know what? He was tired. He was done. He'd been there, bought the t-shirt, and was just ready to go home. And he was pressured, and he tried to run Korea from Tokyo. There was a reason he was asked to retire. There was such huge, the troops were just demoralized. And General Matthew Ridgway came on board, and Oliver P. Smith was a Marine. And the first two things that these generals did, they didn't tell anybody they were coming. They did commandeer a Jeep, and they drove around where their troops were assigned. And at the end of Ridgway, after he had done his tour, he came in officially and introduced himself, and he wanted to talk to the soldiers. And they had built this huge dais for him to stand up among this whole crowd. You know, just imagine like the USO, the movies of those big stages. And he said, no, I want to be shoulder to shoulder. So they convinced him they had a Coca-Cola, one of those old wooden crates where the Coca-Cola bottles were kept. And they turned that crate upside down and he stood on it. And I still get chills. He said, gentlemen, I am going to give you my utmost, and I hope you will give me the same. Is that amazing? He told these troops that he was going to work really, really hard. He wasn't going to take a vacation in a hotel in Tokyo. He was going to be right there with them. He rolled up his sleeves, and he was showing leadership by example. And by sharing that he had some empathy, he understood some of the hardships, some of the challenges, he was able to instill confidence. Yes, Ravani, those are the true leaders. And that's where we look at servant leaders. That's where some of that came from. And just like when we talk about project managers, they planned for success. When General Smith went out, there were 3 troops, and God bless them all. The original plans had the 3 troops coming together, and they were all convening, and they would have all ended up shooting each other. And he changed that strategy. He also looked around and thought, what is the problem? He ended up building 2 airstrips, one for planes coming in and one for planes going out. So he was thinking about the operations, what people needed for success, and he was really good at getting the funds and getting buy-in from the upper folks who gave him the budget. And that's where we get into stakeholder management. Now we get to the Vietnam War, and that was not one of America's finest moments. I'm not going to go into the politics, but what happened when the generals who first came in and took over from the French in the early 60s, the French said, could we share some of our lessons learned? We really appreciate that, you know, you're coming, you're taking over. We can't do this anymore. I'm not sure of all the political reasons. And they said, we don't need to listen to you. We don't have time. We saved your butts in World War II. We're just going to come in and bomb the hell out of them. Well, history played out. That wasn't exactly the right solution. And so what the first lesson I take from here is collaborative listening. Getting that stakeholder feedback. They should have listened to the French. They should have listened to the South Vietnamese generals. They should have opened their perspectives and recognized what had happened, because they wanted to do the same, you know, they wanted to run the war the same way they'd run it in Europe. And the terrain was different, the cultures were different, the people were different. And when General Abrams came in, he was trying to implement some of this, but it was really too late. The political damage had been done. And I'm sure there are many Vietnam vets out there, and they were mistreated and should not have been caught up in the politics. So to all the Vietnam vets, I'm going to say thank you for your service. And you need to, from a project management viewpoint, is acclimate appropriately. You need to be flexible. You know, how much client buy-in? You know, clients are much more compassionate when you can choose the small issues to be flexible. And then when the real problems happen and you have to hold your ground, you know, it's choosing your battles. Because you were flexible, they'll be willing to work with you on some of those more important aspects. And communication, communication, communication. Letting people on your team, letting the customer, the stakeholder know what is going on. You're not protecting anybody by putting up a brave facade. You know, again, team leadership is not a solo sport. You need to let those people who are on your team know what's going on. Now, sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's not appropriate. I worked in a SIP, or a secure lab, for 19 months, and I only had a secure clearance. And every now and then I'd be asking a question from someone who had a top secret clearance, and they would just get really quiet. And I go, oops, above my pay grade, right? And they kind of nod. And then it was a joke in DC. Sometimes they would smile and wink and say, yeah, I'd have to shoot you. And sometimes I would say that back to them. So, you know, you can't, somebody once said, you can't always open your kimono, but you need to let people, you know both sides of an issue. And if it is something that does not need to be shared, because you're transparent in every other way, they will respect, you know, your position. Let's see, Amber says that you, in another session, you learn to challenge your beliefs. Just don't tell someone to do something differently. Ask why they're doing it. I think that goes along with being flexible and communicating well. Amber, you are fabulous. I wish you were in the audience for all my presentations, because you're my lead-in for the Gulf War, for General Powell and General Schwarzkopf. What I learned from the Gulf War is to enlarge your perspective. And what was so powerful about the Gulf War is there were multiple countries, and most of them spoke Arabic. Many of them, not all of them, observed the Muslim faith, but each of those countries had a different culture. And these two generals were wise enough to realize that they needed to address each of these countries individually and get buy-in from all of them to make their strategy move forward. And that is what is so valuable here, is that's how you shift circumstances. You're going to apply the appropriate lessons learned. You're going to avoid short-term thinking, because you're paying attention, you're being present, you're recognizing maybe somebody else has some experience. You know, when you're in a brainstorm session and there might be a couple people not responding, it could be they're shy, you may want to approach them separately, but they might have something really important to say that you hadn't thought about. Nothing makes me crazier than the people who play dead. And how I define that is, how often have we been in meetings, somebody's in the back of their room, the arms are crossed, they're rolling their eyes, they don't have time to be here. And then something bad happens because somebody missed a detail. And that person looks up and says something like, oh, I could have, like, you know, of course, I saw that would happen. And you just want to give them more than a give slap. You just want to punch them out and say, why didn't you speak up and tell us? And that's where we get with innovative thinking. You know, involve all those stakeholders, build coalitions. You know, we get into matrix team management. And as a project manager, we mentioned you're fussing with people. You know, you're trying to get someone for extra hours and their reporting manager wants to use them for something else and you're negotiating. You know, you've got to think about coalition building. Think about what's important to that other person and maybe think about something you have to give and you can come out win-win. Years ago, I was running a global team and we were education and we had to work with a software development team. And I had to send my trainers over to make the beta training. And I kept saying, when can we come? When can we come? And the manager kept stalling. And I did build some trust. I promised him cone of silence. And finally he said, it's delayed. I said, how long? He said, 9 months. It turned out that he needed testers. And I said, well, my trainers were well versed in the original version. I said, do you think my trainers could test it since they're familiar? And he went, they could. And I said, but I have a problem. I have no travel money. And he had no personnel money, couldn't hire anybody. So he said, but I have travel money. And so he paid their airfare and lodging, and I gave my 2 trainers. And did you know that software came in 1 week after the original date, which I consider to be on time. And it's only because we trusted each other to look at where our shortfalls were. So I want to give time for questions and discussions. Let me jump into a summary of the lessons I learned from this book. Now you can see how powerful, when I looked at it through my emotional intelligence lens, is World War II. You've got to give people second chances. Even at our best, we're going to err. We can't think from every perspective. We can't think of every possibility. And change is going to happen. You might have made those decisions 2 years ago when you wrote the RFP and you finally got the bid, you won it, and then it took you another 6 months to plan it. And what happened? Things changed. And if you bid, you know, firm price, good Lord, then you go back and forth, who's going to pay for that change? The Korean conflict is being present, paying attention that details do matter. The Vietnam War, you can't, just because it's always been done, doesn't mean you have to keep doing it that way. So adapt with change. And then the Gulf Wars, I learned, from the Gulf Wars, I learned about enlarging your perspective, really working hard. I see several people agreed with me that if you can pay attention to your stakeholders and you can address their concerns, I think an adage we used to say back when I was growing up in the South was you can catch more flies with honey. You know, that's what really paying attention to their perspective and understanding, being transparent with them so they understand you. And then you can really be authentic. I know that's being transparent and authentic. And what authentic means to me is not only talking, but walking what you say. And the more that you walk what you say, the quicker and more easily you'll build that trust that's so important. Now, I will tell you.
Before we go to the next slide, we had some feedback early on. One, kudos to you. Michael said that this is very positive and affirming webinar, so kudos on that.
Thank you.
Patrick acknowledged that he always emphasizes with his teams that if you're not making a mistake now and then, you're not trying. So
good point.
He also quoted Mythbusters, failure is always an option. And then the food stash, we acknowledge that. A couple of people say that they do take their vacation, but sometimes have it roll over. And James says that he didn't used to take all of his PTO, but now he does because he realizes he needs it and deserves it. So
yeah, oh
great,
my gosh.
insight
we all
there.
deserve it.
Mm-hmm. We had somebody agree that there's, trying to find that one. It's a blessing when you have a boss or a manager who's also a leader. So there's often a big difference between bosses and leaders.
Yes.
We got the one about the tell somebody or ask why they're doing it differently. In my industry, they call that going to the gemba, see how the work is done. And
Very interesting.
for the quiet person who doesn't say anything, John says we may have to ask that person or wait them out to get their input. There's some good observations.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to make sure we have some time for questions. And I think I've talked a little bit about how all of these lessons that I learned from the generals, you know, apply to project management. And of course, the number one is the people. It is always the people. And that's how I moved from technical training into project management and leadership development. Because during that software project, when I had that moment with my software director, I realized that technology was not going to drive business. It was the people that drove business. And, you know, it's like, oh, it's the people, stupid. It took me like 20 years to figure that out. So I'm hoping that my bumps and bruises may help you figure that out more easily. When you look at risk assessment, very much like several of the generals, you know, how are you going to mitigate it? Let's look at this from all ends, multiple perspectives. Let's provide training so people can learn how and mentor, you know, mentoring between people. I just have to, there we go. How we mentor between people. You know, unofficial mentoring is sometimes the strongest education. We mentioned multiple perspectives. You know, adapting to change, you know, being able to adapt, you know, recognize the change and adapt is so very, very important. And Kath mentioned that I work with Lego Serious Play, which is very different from playing with Lego. If you haven't seen the Lego movie, definitely watch it. It's not a kid flick. My husband and I borrowed our neighbor's kids to go, you know, ages 4 through 10. And in the middle of the film, I had the 4-year-old on my lap and I was fishing a pen and paper out of my purse. I was like, Audrey, move over. I got to write this down. And what was so powerful about Emmett, who's the lead, is at the end of the day, he became the hero because he knew how to read blueprints and make a plan. And more importantly, he knew how to change that plan. And so you really change, and being able to recognize that is truly key. I was not thrilled with the second Lego movie in Batman. That just didn't float my boat, but get the original. You'll really appreciate it. And then obviously be present and maintain communications. So what are some of the ways you manage risk? Whew. Well, how about the easy out answer? That depends. How I like to manage risk is educate myself. Really talk with as many people as you can. Say, and be honest. I've trained my daughter and now I share it with everybody. Be direct and kind. You know, daughters can be the cruelest to their mothers. I was like, I appreciate your constructive comments, but could you at least be kind about it? So, you know, go to people and say, I really trust you. I respect your opinion. Would you take a look at this? Am I missing something? Would you recommend a different strategy? And, you know, they will, because you've announced their trust. I believe in huge, we can't do it today, big butcher blocks. Let's put up every single possibility we can think about. How do we, how can we prevent it from happening? If it happens, what can we do to mitigate it? It goes back to the basics of communication, establishing trust, and using your network, using the people, even if, you might have a mentor that you worked with on another project. And obviously there are some things you have to keep close to the vest, but if you're concerned, ask their opinion. For the 2 cents, you might get a really cool return on investment.
Susan James asked, what's some of your wisdom for managing prima donna stakeholders?
Oh, gosh. Oh, you know what? About 20 years ago, I was going to write a book called Managing Like a Mom or Dad. And I realized by the time people would buy it, they already were and had already learned those lessons. So sometimes they're just cowboys. And I think you have to acknowledge their knowledge because they probably do have a significant skill set. But then perhaps if you ask questions or get them to dig a little deeper, they might realize that they need to check with other people, that they may not have all the answers. There's a wonderful concept, it wasn't mine, but I'm going to grab it from others, called educated ignorance, in the fact that the more you realize how much you know, you also realize how much you don't. So while you recognize them, so you're not demeaning or belittling them, ask some digging, probing questions how they came to that, and somebody, it's the 5 W's, why, what, when, and someone said to ask somebody why 5 times. They'll say something, you go, well, why do you think that? And they might go a little deeper, and then you can say, well, what made you come to that decision? Or where did you get that information? And as you start probing, hopefully they'll realize that, they're part of a team. And I don't know if that's helpful. Yes, I have had some. I managed 52 trainers at one point in my career, and 2/3 of them were cowboys. One of them looked at me. What was that?
Go ahead with your story.
Oh, I was just finishing. One of them, I really wasn't momming them, but it was Friday afternoon. They wanted to go home. And it was early. It was 3 o'clock, but they had to turn the classroom over for Monday. And he was being obnoxious. And I looked at him, and I must have said something with a tone. And he looked at me, he goes, "You're not my mother." And I looked at him and I said, "You good, because my kids would not behave like this." So anyway,
nice.
You had a question?
Somebody acknowledged another movie that The Great Escape. Somebody used it in a presentation several years ago, apparently quite memorable, to break down a project plan, a RACI chart, stakeholders, risk, monitoring, control, the whole works.
Oh, it's
based
fabulous.
on the movie.
I totally get it on Netflix. Totally. Oh, yes, great movie.
Sydney says, make that difficult person think they thought of the idea.
Absolutely.
It's always a winner.
Yep, or I had a boss that was difficult. He had always had to be his idea. So I'd have a meeting before the meeting. There were 4 of us, and they always nominated me. He was the same age as my older brothers. So I kind of treated him like my older brothers. And I would share an idea in private, discuss why it was a great idea, and then he'd walk into a meeting and it would be totally his idea. And the deal was, it was for my trainers. I really didn't care whose idea it was. I wanted my trainers to get more time off, get the pay raise, whatever it was. So that is a great idea, Sydney. Excellent.
We have 5 minutes left. Any additional questions? So, Susan, from the time I first reconnected with you and learned about the serious Lego play, I've wondered and thought you might say just a little bit about the serious Lego play.
Sure, I even have a slide. So for those of you that are not familiar with Lego Serious Play, I'm sure you could raise your hands how many of you love Lego. You know, it's fabulous. But when and when you're building Lego in a project management environment, you'll go to team building and you're told, you know, whichever team builds the strongest bridge gets bragging rights, and they give you Lego bricks and poster board and string, and you have at it. The key is you plan. You have to plan, consider your alternatives, manage risk, adapt as you figure things out. Well, it does make me a little crazy because you're not allowed to plan in Lego Serious Play. You use Legos to create metaphors. So they say your fingers do the building. And you ask a question, and so it's done for team building or some strategy sessions. You know, if you have, maybe it's an operational factory and things are just all mucked up and everybody's blaming the other department, you can bring them together and ask some questions. And what happens is you all tell your story. It's like passing that stick, the talking stick. And no one's allowed to interrupt. So as you share your story, the other people from other departments start to hear it. And by the end of that talking stick, everybody recognizes reality from their point of view. So then the power is everybody recognizes what point A is. And then the next part of that exercise is, what does success look like? And that's point B. Now the hard part is getting from point A to point B. But the magic is you're not at crosshairs. You're all working within the same goal, the same metrics, so your efforts are running in parallel. And the photo that I've shown up here, this is from April. And whoops, it was right after the pandemic. I was getting my certification, and we were all on Zoom. And we used Mural to put some photographs up. And we were asked, and it's early April, the pandemic was still brand new. Nobody knew what was going on. And so the question was, what was our reaction to the pandemic? And so over here, you know, people were starting to connect, calling up, finding old friends, and this is what their story was. Somebody else talked about the need for planning. You know, we were all caught off guard. Many of us had not planned because we'd never considered it. Somebody else talked about overflowing emotions. Don't lose your head. I don't think you can see it, but I think somebody's head's falling off. You know, there was that whole concept about social distancing versus spatial distancing. You know, so spatial, people would talk to each other from 6 feet away. Social distancing, you know, they wouldn't talk to each other at all in different buildings. Here we have someone talking about learning how to use technology. I mean, we're all old pros at Zoom, but Zoom was pretty scary in early April. Talked about becoming a screen culture. As our children all go back to school, we can relate to that. And some people are going back to simplicity. How many folks started baking sourdough bread? My husband has. How many people have started growing gardens? And so sometimes we start to appreciate those simpler times. And that's those metaphors that we construct. And we had 3 minutes, we had 5 minutes to build two constructs. So that's not very much, but it was our visceral reaction to a really stressful time. And that's kind of the power of Lego Serious Play.
Well, we're at time and we're facing a 15-minute break. Susan, thank you very much for your presentation. Audience, thank you for the questions and the interaction. Show her some love in the chat as you
Thank
disconnect.
you.
And
can I
and
say
if
one
you have
thing?
questions for, oh, go right ahead.
I was just going to say, if you want to learn more about any of this, connect with me. You can do it on LinkedIn or send me an email. You can never have too many friends. So I'm sorry, Kath, I cut you off.
Oh, no worries. Her LinkedIn is Susan Schwartz, PMP. And you can connect with her in the Attendify community as well, and she'll get back to you as also. Again, thank you very much. Have a great rest of conference.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.